Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's episode of Talk to Me. Today we'll be talking about a really important topic, and that's adoption. So the title for today's session is Should We Be Adopting as Muslims here in the UK? Today I'm joined with our Sheikh Usman, who is our faith advisor at My Adoption Family. And we'll also be joined online shortly with our guest, Adam Dalal, who is an adoption panel advisor for Adoption Now. Let me introduce myself. I'm Shakib Junaija. I'm also from My Adoption Family, and I'll also be your host today. What's really important for us to remember, first of all, before we go into this topic, is that there are around 90,000 children in care in the UK today. And about 5% of those 90,000 children come from a Muslim background or Muslim heritage, or are from Muslim families. And we're talking about almost 2,000 to 3,000 children in the care sector who the judges said that these children really need to be in another family. Their birth families really can't look after them. They need to be adopted. And that's the topic of discussion today. Today we joined with our special guest, Brother Adam Dalal, who is an adoption panel advisor for Adoption Now, a regional adoption agency in the Northwest. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Adam.
Wa alaikum assalam. Shakib, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, how are you doing? Great to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Brother Adam, we're talking today about adoption here in the UK or in England. And the topic of discussion for us is why adoption? Is it something that Muslims should be doing? Should Muslims be adopting? And I think the key question for us is really to understand what is actually going on when we want to think about adoption. So is there any facts and figures that you can perhaps share with us around Muslim children in care and why adoption is a really important part to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've already touched, Shakib, on the number of Muslim children who are in the care system. So that's a reality that Muslim children are in the care system. Now, whilst the vast majority of children who are in the system often will end up being placed back at home, a small proportion of those children will have a plan for adoption and will be placed for adoption. Now, whilst the government has removed the requirement to find a culturally and religiously appropriate family, that doesn't mean that children can't be placed in families that can meet their faith and cultural needs. So there are children in the care system for whom the plan is adoption, who are of Muslim background. And for me, it's a really simple process whereby if we are aware as a community that we have Muslim children in the care system who need an adoptive family who are able to share the child's cultural and religious background, then for me, it's incumbent on us as a community to step forward to provide a home for these children.
Jazakallah khairan, yes, Adam. And I think the kind of key question here is then, we're talking about adoption, and how does that become different from perhaps fostering or maybe some other form of care in the system?
Yeah, yeah. So it is very different. Fostering is a short term. It can be long term fostering, but with fostering, the child remains looked after by the local authority, and you are acting as a carer for that child on behalf of the local authority. The birth family remain involved, and the child is not a part of your family. Is a child who is living in your family who you are looking after. Adoption is a plan that's agreed through the court process. So the local authority for children who it is determined cannot live within their birth family. And I think it's really important to stress here that when a plan for adoption is agreed, it isn't allowed. But in terms of Muslim children in the care system, I think we've initially was, you know, do we have Muslim children in the care system? Because we as a community look after our children. And the reality is that they are, Muslim children deserve the same level of protection from harm as every other child. And if they are not being kept safe within their families, then the state will become involved because ultimately the child's best interests are paramount above everything else.
And
We do need families. Sorry.
and the bottom line there, Adam, is that what we're saying is that there simply isn't enough adoptive carers out there. But again, looking at the Muslim community, we don't have enough adoptive parents from the Muslim community as well. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely right. You know, we don't have enough carers for children of a Muslim background to be placed with Muslim families, and across the range, you know, sibling groups, younger children, slightly older children. But no, you know, we need to identify and to bring forward more families from the Muslim community on a national basis. You know, we're talking about all over the England and Wales in terms of that focus and that recruitment, and it's shows such as these and the endeavours of organisations such as yourself that will support that recruitment campaign.
No, Jazakallah Khan, that's really, really important to hear. And I think some of the facts that we know from the sector already is that, you know, black children who are waiting for adoption, you know, they wait 4 times longer than children from other ethnicities or white children, you know, and it's, you know, simple facts like that. And knowing that actually a large proportion of the black population here in the UK and England is actually made up from Muslims, you know, that's an important consideration. But you raised a very important point here around how some people in the Muslim community are still kind of debating whether adoption is even allowed. Sheikh Usman, what is the Islamic position? What is our guidance in terms of, you know, how do we see adoption? Is it a responsibility? Is it something which, you know, we could do? But how does it sit upon the Muslims here in the UK?
I think we need to look at the issue of adoption and taking care of children from the perspective of we as believers, what part of the body we are of. In a famous hadith, that the believers unto each other are like a whole body. And that when one part of the body suffers pain, suffers fever, then the whole body is restless and feels that and is affected by that illness, ailment, deficiency, whatever. So as an ummah, if you are hurting, then I should feel your pain. So that is the ideal that we all aspire to. And in society, those that have the ability and can have their say, and they are independent adults, then they will speak up for what their needs are. But then you have those that are vulnerable in society who don't have that voice, or their voice is rarely heard. Then we have a duty of care towards them as well. So we feel their pain and we do something to alleviate that pain. So from that holistic perspective, whether it's an orphan or not, a child in need is a child that we need to be helping. So that's as a general thing. In terms of adoption as a policy or a particular practice, then we have in the story of Sayyidina Zayd bin Haritha radiallahu ta'ala an, who was like known as the adopted son of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so much so that people began to address him as not Zayd bin Haritha, but Zayd bin Muhammad. And that was the cultural practice before Islam. And these are the early days of Islam, and things are still evolving. And then there is revelation in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that you should not call them except by the name of their fathers. And if you don't know their father's name, or if you don't know their lineage, then they are your brothers and your sisters in faith. So from that point of view, the practice, what was known as at-tabanni in Arabic, which is you make someone your own child as if they are their own, to such an extent that you erase their lineage history, right? That is what is prohibited in Islam. A child has a birthright to know where its origins are from, what its lineage and heritage is. That is the child's birthright. And we should not do anything that erases that. As long as we can maintain that sense of identity and belonging, then in all kind of sense of caring for that individual, you should care for them as your own child, so that that child doesn't feel a sense of inferiority, but feels able to thrive like any other child that is, you know, with nurturing, loving, caring parents around them.
So just just this issue before we go on, and I think it'd be good to get Brother Adam, your understanding of how practically it works here in the UK. If we're saying that it's forbidden to break that lineage of the child in Islam, in adoption, practically in the UK, Adam, when a child is adopted, does that child continue to have any interaction with their birth parents or their lineage or heritage, or is that cut off? What's the reality in practice?
Yeah, this always makes me smile because adoption law, as it existed pre-70s in the UK, was very much about you take the child as your own, and that child will never find out about their birth family, the birth history, the birth parents. And in 1976, I think, adoption law was overhauled, and the new Adoption Act came in line with Islamic teachings. So Islam had been saying since the revelation that Sheikh just spoke about in terms of maintaining a child's lineage and heritage and the child's right to know about their birth family. In 1976, the law was amended to highlight the importance of a child, even though they're placed in an adoptive family, and that adoptive family will become the child's family, and you provide that child with whatever you would with your own child, and you treat them like your own child. You have a duty and a responsibility as an adoptive parent to share information with that child about their birth family. So adoption practice now, and in terms of that sort of life story work as it's known, has evolved. So you have a child placed for adoption now, you will be given as much information as is available about the birth family, the birth mother, the birth father, the extended birth family, pictures of anybody that they have pictures of, an opportunity to maintain contact. So you can do letterbox contact that's sort of supported by the local authority. So you don't change and exchange addresses. You don't know where each other live, but you can exchange letters through the local authority, updating the birth family with how the child's doing, what they're doing in school, what they're doing in madrasa, how far they've got, how much they know about them. And then the birth parent can write back telling you as the adopted family about where they are, how they are doing, and so on. So that sense of child growing up knowing my adoptive family look after me, take care of me on a day-to-day basis, but these are my birth parents, this is the person that gave birth to me, these are the people that are part of my birth family heritage, these are the people that are looking after me now. All of that is there, and that's in adoption practice and law. That's evolved to step in to sort of come in line with Islamic teachings. So alhamdulillah, that barrier that people perceive and put up is not there. You have the information and you have the ability.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah. So this is now, I think, an understanding that perhaps many people from the Muslim community just need to have, and I think this is really important in this discussion, because what we're saying is that haram element of what might be seen as a tabanni, or adoption that might have been forbidden, is it doesn't really practically happen. There is a big possibility that a child, not just a possibility but an encouragement, and we talked about, we heard about this life story book that Brother Adam's talking about. The child will know their lineage, the child will be connected to their lineage. So Sheikh, now given that this is the situation here in the UK, we don't have enough Muslims coming forward to take these Muslim children into care. How does this responsibility sit on everybody? Is this something which we can say now is, some Muslims should really give this consideration? I mean, what would be your advice here to Muslims?
I mean, my advice would be that Muslims should step forward and be proactive in this field. The term at-tabanni, when it has been translated from Arabic into English, the translators have found the word adoption to translate the concept of tabanni, right? And that's why when you Google search or you ask scholars, a straight translation from at-tabanni into the English language means orphan, right?
Adoption.
Adoption.
Yeah.
And therefore, adopting a child, whether orphan or not, right, is understood to be haram, impermissible. And this is where the confusion stems from. At-tabani as a practice that existed, right, is not what adoption is right now.
Practically here in
the UK context. And our respected ulama kiram and our community key elders and influencers need to understand that when you see in literature adoption as being impermissible, it is adoption in the context of at-tabanni, which is different to providing that care and that nurturing and that bringing support to a vulnerable child, either through adoption, fostering, or any other means, right, is something that is totally separate and something that we are encouraged. And I would say that it's not just something that we are encouraged to say that it is mustahab. I feel we are duty bound as a duty of care to the vulnerable in society to be their voice, to look after their needs, to advocate for them, to ensure that they have an equal life chance as they grow up. Because if that vulnerability is not addressed by us collectively as a Muslim community, then that vulnerability can lead into so many unhelpful and unhealthy directions as the children grow up without that nurture and care of a responsible, caring adult. Yeah. So it's a responsibility, an obligation, a duty on those that are able to provide that care to step forward and be proactive in this arena.
Yeah, and that really brings out the importance of why we're talking about this topic. Should Muslims be adopting? And I think, we've looked at how the misconceptions, and I myself have been on Google, and you type in Islam and adoption, and actually the first few searches that come up do say it's haram. You do get this. But the reality of the situation, and practically, as we've heard from Brother Adam, is that applied in this country, it's something which is very much in line with what Islam would want to see Muslims doing. And this then becomes a duty and an obligation on those people who can do it. And I wanted to just talk here about my adoption family, because Sheikh, you're an advisor, faith advisor for my adoption family. Many people confuse us for an adoption agency. We're a service that works in the adoption sector. We sit on the National Adoption Recruitment Steering Group. Our CEO, Shadim Hussain, also sits with the adoption and the leadership board. So it's the Adoption and Special Guardianship Leadership Board. So we have influence within the sector. We do have a say in how things should be happening. We have a voice, and we can give to the sector and to the adoption agencies, including the regional adoption agencies like Adam's part of, or Adoption Now, and the voluntary adoption agencies nationally, advice around how they should be addressing Muslims and how they should be dealing with Muslims. But you raised a very key point here, because that's not the only issue here. The other side of the issue is the Muslim community, the imams, and the responsibility that sits with them in promoting this duty and obligation. So, I think, from yourself, Sheikh, do we see imams and scholars in the community actually doing this, or do you feel this is something we still need to work on?
I think, with the greatest of respect to the imams, they are doing and meeting the needs of the communities as best as they can, in a way that the community expects them to, whether it's leading salah, whether it's teaching the children, doing halakas, performing marriages, providing counseling, so on and so forth. And we do need to invest in this area. But there's also a review, happening, which happens around, kind of over many years. And through that review of the care sector, policies are formulated for the next 5-10 years. And it's really important, it's crucial for us to have our voice heard, because that will have an impact on policy formulation for the coming years. And our actions and our inaction both have consequences. If we speak up, we can cause influence. So that hadith, that if you see something wrong, then you should try to change it with your hands. If you're unable to do that, fabilisani, you actually raise your voice against the issue that is concerning you. And if you can't, then you feel bad about it in your own heart. And that is the weakest form of our iman. We are, alhamdulillah, living in an environment where we have the ability to raise our voice and have that voice heard. And this is timely that we mobilize ourselves in a way to influence that dialogue and discussion that's happening around the K8 sector, both for the elderly as well as for the younger children.
So, Sheikh, I want to bring Adam here. Adam, you know, we're very close to coming to the end of this first part of this conversation. Now, you've been in the sector for about 10 years or perhaps a lot longer than that. What would be your advice to the imams, the scholars and influencers in the sector? I mean, if you had to just give a very quick summary advice, what would it be?
We need the support of our imams and our scholars. I think the only way the community and the people will begin to think of adoption as a viable route they want to take is if they have the confidence that this is supported by the ulama. We look to our ulamas for guidance and for direction, and that's been my experience, that once we've got the confidence of the ulamas and they are supporting the message, the community will listen and will think about it in a slightly different way. So that's a crucial aspect of any success.
Yeah. Adam, I want to thank you, Jazakallah Khair, for coming on this talk show with us. So Jazakallah Khair, thank you very much, Adam.
Jazakumullah.
Barakallah feek. We are coming to the end of this first section. Stay with us and join us after the break. We've got an adopter who's coming on with us to share his story and his experience of adoption. And then we'll talk a little bit more about My Adoption Family and the kind of advice and help that we can give you if you're thinking about adoption. So stay with us and we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to the discussion about should Muslims be adopting. I'm Shakib Junaija, I'm your host today. We also have with us in the studio Sheikh Usman, who is faith advisor to My Adoption Family. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Usman.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah Khair for being with us, and we'll continue the conversation. We also have with us a special guest, Brother Tanveer, who is an adoptive parent who's online. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Tanveer, how are you doing?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you very much. I'm fine, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah Khair for joining us. Now, before we go further into discussion, just to recap, we've talked about adoption, how practically it works here in the UK. We've talked about adoption from an Islamic perspective and how actually it's not tabanni that we're talking about here. We're not talking about a form of adoption that's been forbidden. We're talking about a form of adoption which actually sits very much in line with what Islam teaches us to do. Therefore, we've concluded from that it is a duty and an obligation for a person who can adopt to come forward and adopt. There are Muslims sitting in the adoption sector. We heard from Brother Adam Dalal, who is adoption panel advisor from Adoption Now, that the situation across the country is that there is a need for adopters. They don't have enough adopters, full stop. And they also don't have enough adopters from the Muslim background. So this is the call, this is the responsibility that we've talked about. It sits with scholars. And I think we'll bring it straight to you now, Brother Tanveer, to talk about your journey. You've become an adoptive parent. And I think it'd be great to hear from yourself in terms of why you chose, you and your wife, why you chose to adopt and how it went for you. So Brother Tanveer, can I ask you to tell us about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, sure. Jazakallah for asking. First of all, it's my pleasure to be here and to share some aspects of our journey. And hopefully that kind of demystifies the process of adopting and some of the apprehensions that sometimes people may have. So I guess with those, the process was very simple in the sense that we were unable to have a child of our own. Well, initially, alhamdulillah, we do have a child of our own now, but in the initial years to conceive. So the idea of adopting crossed our mind because I have an aunt and she adopted a girl, And I guess this is an alien concept in our family. It's something that never crossed the mind of anybody. And when we saw my aunt adopt a girl and how she was accepted within the family and the wider family, and I guess it kind of made us realize that adopting isn't a draconian or alien thing to do. I mean, it's something that naturally, once you've adopted the child, the child becomes yours. There's nothing different about the process of how you raise that child and the feelings of the love that you have towards that child. So in my case, we adopted a boy in the year 2012, and then we adopted again, alhamdulillah, in the year 2017. And then God blessed us with a daughter of our own 1 year after that in 2017. So that's, in a nutshell, our journey.
Jazakallah khair. And, it's lovely to hear, mashallah, that you've adopted not just one child, but two children. And if we were to ask you, in terms of the process of adoption, did you face any challenges? And I can probably imagine that you may have challenges from a number of different areas, but just, as the discussion so far has been around Islam and, some of the things that Muslims might face, have you had any challenges from issues around Islam and adoption, which you think would be worth sharing with us today?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I guess there's a cultural problem in our community, or maybe a wider community. And I just feel that people kind of are not, there's a transition taking place now, but maybe 8 or 9 years ago, more so, people found it to be a bit of an alien concept. And I think the biggest apprehension people have is, will you be able to love that child as your own? It's not your blood. It's not, come out your wife. You haven't given birth to that child. And I think people have a lot of reluctance around that. And I guess from my perspective, our perspective was a case of, hey, we've seen our aunt do it. It's something we never thought about before. We can practically see that working just fine. Now, from an Islamic point of view, alhamdulillah, I was quite well read. I understood the two basic things, really. The issue regarding the mahram issue that usually is brought up when a child is of a pubic age, adolescent age, and the other issues regarding, not ensuring you don't erase the lineage of the child. So in my case, I had no problem, with any of those issues. The first issue I resolved by myself and my wife visited a nurse, and she kind of advises on the process of how a woman can lactate through medication and going through this particular process, even though she's not pregnant or conceived a child of her own. So we overcame that issue, alhamdulillah, by going through that process. And my wife was, alhamdulillah, able to lactate and give some of her milk to both of the children we adopted. In the case of the second child, she was pregnant and had her own child anyway soon after we adopted him, so she was able to naturally produce milk and give to the second adopted child. Whereas in the case of the first child, we went through the process that was advised by the midwife, the nurse, and alhamdulillah, she was able to lactate and give some feed to the child that we first adopted.
Jazakallah khair. I think that's really brought us to a really important, point here around the mahram issue. Sheikh Usman, what would be your advice? I think a lot of people who be watching this show would be thinking about what is the actual issue here around establishing a mahram with a child. What's the general advice that you can give?
I think we need to be practical in this responsibility that we have. The issue of mahram and the issue of segregation and the issue of hijab, these are practical measures that we adopt in our day-to-day lives anyway. We don't come in front of our own biological children uncovered. There is a minimum, but we go beyond the minimum to ensure that there is decorum and it's seen to be appropriate. And when we go out, we don't just cover ourselves to the bare minimum. We make that effort to be civil and that the decorum is sort of maintained. So that general decorum applies across the board. The notion of hijab is that it's not just about a piece of cloth that is covering your hair or covering your face or covering your body. Hijab is also about our behavior towards one another. So when we interact, that interaction, that engagement is deemed appropriate, from a social perspective. And the concept of mahram is that the interaction between people who are deemed mahram, parent, child, brother, sister, uncle, nephew, niece, aunt and nephew. And there are some other categories as well, which create a relationship so close that you are not able to marry them. So in essence, mahram is a close relative, and that relationship is so close that Islamically it's not permitted for you to marry. So with those people who are deemed mahram, you can be relaxed in the way that you speak and you engage and interact with one another. So one of the concerns that people flag up very early on is this issue of mahram, that's going to be a problem, so therefore you should not be taking care of children. The issue of interaction and mahram and hijab come into play when that child becomes a mature adult Islamically.
Yeah.
Right? Until then,
16, maybe 15.
Until then, it's not an issue. And I think the starting point is that we worry more about potential challenges that may come in 10 years' time, right? And as a result of that fear or apprehension, we disregard this opportunity of gaining our Jannah by taking care of a vulnerable child.
And then just on this point here, so Tanveer, if you come back to you and your family and your wife, when you made that decision to see the nurse in order to get advice around how perhaps your wife could produce milk, did you consider or did the thought ever come across to you that perhaps what if it didn't work? What if we were unable to produce milk? Then what we would do? I mean, did you think about what might happen then, and how you might have got through those issues?
I think in our case, we made our mind up that we want to adopt irrelevant, because I guess one needs to get the priorities in order. There are children out there that need adopting and need immediate help. And as the Sheikh just mentioned a few minutes ago, to think about something in 10 years' time or 11 years' time. And as a consequence of that, you don't focus on the immediate need today because of what may happen in 5 to 10 years' time is not probably the best approach or the best way to look at it. So from our perspective, because we were intending to adopt a child under the age of 2, so we explored that possibility and we were able to do it. But I guess if we were unable to do so, I think we would have still gone ahead and adopted. And when we come to that hurdle in 10 or 11 or 12 years' time, we would have seen to that then in terms of the mahram issues and ensuring you maintain that decorum and that segregation. And I sometimes think that in our community, there's a certain degree of hypocrisy as well when it comes to this issue, because when it comes to adopting, everybody all of a sudden is thinking about segregation and all of these other issues. But generally speaking, as the Sheikh mentioned, as long as a certain amount of decorum, dressing appropriately like you would do in and amongst your relatives anyway, and your own children or sibling you do anyway, is maintained, I think you're kind of ticking those boxes anyway, really. So I think sometimes the issue is blown out of proportion, really.
Jazakallah khairan. I think you're absolutely right. And when we look at it in context of what we said earlier, Sheikh, that it's a duty and a responsibility, I think in conclusion, what we're saying is this issue of, if we even call it an issue of mahram or not mahram, is not something that should be given consideration at all. The person should just come forward to become an adoptive parent. Is that right, Sheikh?
I mean, each situation will dictate what the ruling is going to be. So I think it would be inappropriate just to say a general blanket policy to say disregard the issue of mahram and the issue of hijab. That would be not right. And And Alhamdulillah, we are working towards having a sounding board, an advisory board of scholars to help us in this journey, so that we are providing a nuanced solution to the challenges as they come by. But the circumstances dictate what the ruling is going to be. So, for example, under general circumstances, I would not be touching a female who is not my mahram, or not allowing a female to touch me who is not a mahram, unless I'm in a situation of necessity, in a situation of zarura. So if I'm walking down and I have a heart attack and people call the ambulance and 2 paramedics jump out of the vehicle and they come to tend to me and they happen to be female, do I say, no, sorry, I don't want you to touch me? Or do I say, Jazakallah, thank you, may Allah reward you for being here on time? Or if I'm on the operating theatre and the surgeon happens to be a female, do I say, sorry, I want a male surgeon when I'm in a life-threatening situation? Right? So every situation dictates the outcome. So it would be wrong to do a general blanket policy, and we should try to remain as close as we can. But within the UK context, when we're looking at over 4,500 children that are in care, and there is a very, very real risk, and there are many examples in front of us already, where there is a genuine fear of their iman being lost as a result of our not taking any action as a community. So, sitting quiet and not taking any action, not speaking up, is not an option. That we do need to be proactive and be practical, in a situation. And I think the current circumstances dictate that we do need to, look at this seriously, because look at the wider ramifications of that on the Muslim Ummah. And the local Muslim community. And if Muslims shy away from taking care of children that are not their own biological children, what sort of message of a religion of compassion are we giving to wider British society? And that's an important consideration, because we are living as a minority faith community within a largely secular society. And the spotlight is on us on many fronts. And when we look at the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taking care of children that are vulnerable, right? At that moment in time, the intervention is required. He provided that intervention. And the other considerations, as important as they are, have their own priority and within their own context.
And what's really important here now is, if there is anybody in the audience who's considering, who's really thinking about adoption, or perhaps hasn't really thought about it, but now, as a result of listening to the conversation, is having thoughts. These issues, you can reach out to the Sheikh at imam@myfosterfamily.com with any questions that you may have around the mahram issue, around issues to do with, just thoughts and things that you might have in your head that you might feel are perhaps you're not sure about, or inheritance, or naming the child, and some of the other things that Brother Tanveer mentioned. But you can reach out to the Sheikh on that email, and like the Sheikh said, we'll have a panel of scholars and a sounding board, to bring any advice to you, to make sure that it is good advice, and it's advice that has been approved by the scholars. Brother Tanveer, I want to come back to you and just look at another element of adoption. Some people, when they think about adoption, a lot of people have come forward to say that they've not had very good experiences with the adoption agency or social workers, etc. What could you suggest in this regard? I mean, did you go through any difficult experiences or challenges with social workers or the adoption agency?
I would say I would put this really very much down to the social worker that you're appointed, really. And that's just, look, if you have a social worker that's proactive, very helpful, not somebody who's just working part-time, flexibly for the council, then I guess you're going to have more of a positive experience. If you have somebody who's quite reactive, not very proactive, the process can be a lot more longer and draining. But I guess I wouldn't say it's difficult. It's not as though you've got to, dedicate a tremendous amount of time doing courses or anything like that. But I guess it's just you've got to be patient through the process, because they have certain things that they need you to do, So, for example, they need to write your life story. They need to find out about your background. They need to write this report up. You need to write some of it up with them. Again, for both partners, they'll do that. They will interview close family members of yours to get a reference on you, some close friends. They'll try to understand your social circle. They'll try to get some medical records on you. They will also look into, for example, if you're financially stable. That doesn't mean you've got to be wealthy. Just, are you financially stable? You're not under some massive financial debt or strain that will impede your ability to maybe adopt or financially take care of a child. So these things they have to do anyway, and you understand why they do that. They're doing that for the protection of the child. This isn't about placing a child with you that suits you. It's first about placing a child with a family that suits the child. That's a priority. That suits the child, and then thereafter suits you. So they're going to do their due diligence, and I fully understand and appreciate and acknowledge why they have to do that. But I guess the only thing I would suggest is that if the social worker is somebody who's not very proactive, not very quick, you'll get through the process, but the process might take longer than, let's say, 6 months or 3 months. It might take a year. And also it depends on you as well, how proactive you are in responding to emails, filling out forms, volunteering information that they may require. I guess I was very busy, so sometimes the delay would be on my part as well in responding. But the second time I adopted, the process was completely different. I mean, I guess some of the checks already had on us, but moreover, the social work was different, and we felt that the process was a lot more smoother, a lot more quicker, headache-free, really.
So, just the last thing, Brother Tanvir, just to wrap all of this up. Now, you've, mashallah, adopted 2 children, and you've got your own birth child as well, mashallah. So, how is it now in your family? How are these children growing up? Are they happy? How is it at the end of all of this that you've done now? How does it look now?
This is the God's honest truth. Maybe you can see it in my eyes. Nothing in this world would make myself or my wife replace those 2 children for a birth child in their place. Those 2 children, we love them. We can't imagine loving them or wanting for them. If they were biological, I mean, I can't differentiate. It's just not possible. If anything, I'm maybe more inclined towards my eldest, who was adopted, more so than my the younger 2, even though he was the first adopted. So I think this thing about the child being your blood child, and then you have this further love, or maybe I genuinely believe that everybody I've met who's adopted, once you have a child and that child calls you mom, dad, and you do everything for that child, that bond and that love comes from above. It's the natural bond and love that grows there that you can't imagine different if you'd given birth to that child.
Jazakallah khair. Brother Tanvir, a really emotional story, and the end to that story there, mashallah. May Allah put barakah in your family, and we thank you for joining us today. Yeah, Jazakallah khair for joining us and being with us. Brother Tanvir, we're going to move on to this topic here now with the Sheikh, which is around My Adoption Family has produced toolkits in the sector for the adoption sector here in the UK. And this isn't work that started from a blank sheet. A lot of different organizations have produced guidance documents for Muslims and around adoption and fostering, in the sector for a number of years. But this topic of adoption and toolkits, practical guidance, there were 3 toolkits. The first one was around the social workers, to get them to understand the challenges that Muslim adopters might face in the sector and how to come through those challenges in a better way. And much of that was based around trying to address some of the bias that might come out and some of the subconscious bias there, but also give them an understanding of the cultural differences. And so faith and cultural literacy and humility were a big part of those toolkits. The second toolkit was to the general Muslim population, some of the issues that we covered today with Brother Adam and also Brother Tanvir around how the process works, the checks that you'll have to go through and how long it might take. and some of the basic questions that we've covered today. But this third toolkit, Sheikh, and I think, this third toolkit is something that, I'd like you to talk about. The third toolkit was produced for the Muslim scholars. So why was this third toolkit, why was there felt a need to produce this third toolkit just for the Muslim scholars and the imams? And what's the message of this third toolkit, Sheikh?
Okay, quite a comprehensive question. We need to understand both the historical background and contextualize it within our current environment. Life before Islam was different. Life during the early era of Islam brought about a lot of changes in society, and the treatment of orphans and vulnerable people were part of that positive change in being child-centered, in being centered towards a vulnerable person and trying to look at it, from their perspective. So if you look at the guidelines, if you look at the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you find that it's not a top-down approach, it's very much, a child-centered approach. And mashallah, after, 14 centuries, we have modern-day practitioners making comments and statements about the care of vulnerable children that are in line with the ethos that Islam promoted 1400 years ago. If we look at the legislation around fostering and adoption, it's quite relevant within a modern-day UK context. So they're still kind of learning and it's still evolving. And we have, 14 years of history.
14,000 years,
yeah. That we can kind of, draw.
Or 1,400 years.
1,400 years that we can draw, from the richness of that history. But we've got to look at it here and now in terms of what is the reality. Life was different in Mecca and Medina in many respects. And life in the UK is quite different. This has become a melting pot globally of different nationalities, different languages, different cultures coming in. And therefore, that has brought with them, the culture and the language has brought with them particular habits and particular outlooks on life. And this is where the misunderstanding between at-tabanni and adoption, right, comes into play. Whereas some have said, because of the literal translation of at-tabanni as adoption, they're saying, no, we can't do this. But then when they've scratched the surface and realized, no, this is, purely in line with the religious teachings of taking care.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. This conversation has been a very, very eye-opening conversation. What will be your closing statements for this?
My closing statement is this, that we are amongst many in the sector that are working for the benefit of children in need, and that we should be collaborating with everyone that's there in the sector to bring about those change. But at a personal level, what I would say is, when you buy food for your children, when you buy gifts for Eid and Ramadan, when you are there when your child achieves something and you are celebrating, all of those joyous moments, spare a moment for those children who don't have parents or carers around them, to be with them in their hour of need, in their joy, in their happiness.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. It has been a fantastic conversation today. We hope that you've all enjoyed it. And if there's anybody out there who is interested in learning more about adoption, lots of information available on different websites around adoption. Adoption Now, where Adam Dalal's been, but also My Adoption Family, where Sheikh is. You can always visit their website or send them an email. So from me and everybody else here, we look forward to seeing you in the next session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.